Keys to the Shop Creative Rise series brought to you by Roast Magazine. Today we're talking with Mike Ebert about illustrative sample roasting. Well, hey everybody, this is Chris DeFurio with Keys to the Shop. Welcome to another episode of Rate of Rise, elevated conversations on roasting, brought to you by Roast Magazine, which is one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in the coffee industry. And they have a new series called Roast Audio Articles, which presents articles from the Roast Magazine archive. In them, they keep up to date with the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and professionals from across the industry. And you can just visit roastmagazine.com/audio articles to peruse episodes via your web browser, or you can listen and subscribe on SoundCloud to access new issues as they are released. Now, in these conversations on Rate of Rise, we talk to authors of these articles that are part of the audio article series. And today, we are going to be talking with Mike Ebert of Firedancer Coffee Consultants about his article on illustrative sample roasting. So a little bit about Mike. He's the founder of Firedancer Coffee Consultants. Mike is dedicated to helping clients create a personalized strategy to ensure long-term success, and he works primarily with roasters, producers, and retailers, drawing on his extensive experience in all facets of the specialty coffee supply chain. It's over 35 years of experience to guide clients in reaching their potential. So he is an Authorized SCA Trainer, holding the professional level certifications in green coffee, sensory skills, roasting, and brewing, and he has had a hand in many positions up and down the supply chain, continues his volunteer work with the Specialty Coffee Association's Education Advisory Council, and is a co-chair of the Education Content Committee. And so I'm really excited to talk with Mike, as somebody with his experience in the industry obviously has a lot to share. When we can master sample roasting and use it as a tool to illustrate what the coffee can do, it really sets up a path of success for that coffee down the line. And in this conversation, we are going to be going over in detail a lot of the practicalities, mechanics, equipment selection, best practices, mindsets, and philosophies that are going to help you use sample roasting as an illustrative tool for your coffees. And so with that said, let's get right into the interview. Here now is my conversation with Mike Ebert of Firedancer Coffee Consultants. Well, Mike, thanks for being on the show. Welcome to Keys to the Shop. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you do a lot of teaching and training. I know we were just talking about how you're on a pretty long stint of training people right now, in fact. So I'm excited to talk to you because you're certainly, 35 years of coffee is quite a bit of knowledge to have and to share with folks.
No, yeah, it's been a long time, 35 years, so I've got lots of mistakes to tell people about. That's what they want to hear most.
That's what we learn the most from, right?
Exactly.
We're here to talk about sample roasting. It seems pretty straightforward when you think about it. Just take a little bit of coffee, make it brown, make a decision, but there's innumerable nuances to that. So in your article talking about illustrative roasting and Roast Magazine, you go into a fair bit of information that would help people get to the bottom of how to practice sample roasting. So I wanted to start just by talking a little bit about, since you've had so much history and a lot of experience doing it wrong, doing it right, and all that, how has sample roasting itself as the concept and practice developed over the years?
That's a very good question. I think I'll go back in time. I started my career at Gloria Jean's Gourmet Coffee. We had what is considered, I don't want to say the gold Cadillac of sample roasters, but a BRZ 2-barrel, brand new. I think it's like a $10,000, and I really didn't even know the purpose, to be honest. We had a big roaster. We weren't buying our own coffee at the time. We were having it roasted, and then we started the journey of roasting our own. And it was really until and I would use it, but it was Ted Lingle called me in like early 90s and said, Mike, send me your sample roast. We're doing a little study. And I was just so excited that Ted Lingle had called me.
Right.
I was a little like, oh, cool. And I hung up and I went, what's a sample roast? So I just did what I would do to taste coffee before I'd buy it. But typically in that stage, my importers were more my mentors. They would often tell me, no, you don't want to buy that one, Mike. And it wasn't self-serving. They were really trying to help. So I didn't take it seriously. And then, so what I found out years later is that what Ted had requested, the sample roast protocol that I describe in the article, it's not a lot of science, and I'm not taking anything away. It was brilliant. It was merely an average of where the industry was at the time. But what it gave us is something to calibrate around. And there's still people today who argue that maybe it's too light or too dark, that we've evolved a little bit. But I would argue, if I was just telling this in a class this week, that 30 years ago, if I were to attend a cupping with you and other people that I know tasted all the time and we taste a bunch of coffees, I'd walk out of there feeling like I was an alien from a different planet. Because really, you taste that? You like that? And we were all over the place. Flash forward today, while the sample roasting and the cupping protocol is, there's still some subjectivity. We all look for things we like. But if I walk out of the room, I go, okay, I'm somewhat aligned. Yeah, maybe, Chris, you like fruit more and I like floral more. And so I may score those just a little higher, but it's utilizing and sample roasting is the base bone of that calibration. So it's kind of huge. And then a little bit forward recently, so it started out just as a way to calibrate around scoring coffee and enable you to buy things objectively and, communicate with importer and farmer and all that. Then it's this, and this is why I named the term illustrative roasting. One is I want to be known for some kind of slang term out there. Everyone has their, so that's why I came up with it. But it was really to say, okay, now I bought this coffee. What's capable of? And so that side of sample roasting almost from a training standpoint, we almost ignore it because there's really no protocols because it's so subjective, but it's what do you want this coffee to do? And, as well as I do, I could take the same coffee and roast it 4 or 5 different ways and they all could be delicious to different people, so it's that illustrative or that more, developing different profiles on what this coffee is capable of that, to me, it's not usually nowadays when people ask me about sample roasting, how to do it, whether it's a student or whoever, that's what they're referring to. They're kind of almost, the green coffee mining side of the protocol is almost, they're almost not aware of it because nowadays, they're the smaller roasters and they're dealing with importers that really take care of them and are giving them what they like. So not that it's not still important in both avenues, but it's come a long way in short.
Well, so it seems like the people that kind of set out the standard, Ted Lingle and the rest around the time you're talking about, provided that foundation, like you said, the base bone, the thing that we take for granted right now in order for us to improvise on top of that and iterate something a little bit more nuanced. It's so like illustrative roasting, like you say, this is something that we all kind of think about when we think about sample roasting unconsciously, because the other aspect of sample roasting, identifying defects and, just accepting that this is a quality control procedure is just kind of part and parcel of being a roaster. So it's hard to think about if you're a new roaster, especially, a time where that wasn't the case, I guess. And I guess the question might be also that, is there a danger, this might be a bit of a tangent, but thinking about illustrative roasting for the purpose of like what do you want the coffee to do, can that overshadow the foundational reason for sample roasting, like identifying defects and everything else? So you're not focusing on the foundation, you're focusing on just the illustrative aspect.
Very good question. And what's interesting about how you asked that, this came up in class yesterday. And I'm teaching roasting intermediate this week. Sample roasting is a part of it, but the protocol we talked about for buying. But what I put the students through is, I have a nice Guatemalan from genuine origin, and it's a beautiful coffee. And basically what we do is I tell them, I want you to do all these crazy things on the roaster. Make the roaster do this. And then we taste it. Not with the idea of finding the sweet spot, because there is no sweet spot for a roast. It's personal subjectivity. And so, and then we go taste, and then it allows them to start piecing together how they like the coffee. In this particular coffee, there was 2 or 3 different versions that everyone was liking, and like they saw the versatility of this particular coffee. But then the subject came up, a little later when I said, hey, let's do the sample roast of this. And one is then they almost took it as, ooh, that's the sweet spot. Everything they had done before was incorrect, which is wrong. Okay. And then we actually found a defect in one of the cups. And it was an oddball. It was a great lot. It's one of those that I doubt if I put another 100 cups on the table, we'd find it. And they were all little shocked, But it kind of comes through circle. It led to a conversation of, like, when I was first buying coffee, even though they were my mentors, I had to look out for myself to a certain extent. They still had coffee to sell, and the girls nowadays, most of the importers that any of the, especially the smaller roasters, are dealing with, they're cupping, they're vetting this coffee, they're super careful. They're looking for defects. I mean, they're not going to be around as an importer if they're known for giving out defects, or problems with coffee. You don't hear about that as much anymore.
Right.
So I sort of sometimes, I know this isn't really answering the question, kind of wonder how important is it as it was back then, so to speak, other than the fact that, almost defect recognition is almost secondary to me, even though it's still important. You still got to know, I say as a roaster, specifically, you got to know when something tastes bad, where did it happen? Was it in the green? Was it in your roast? Or was it in your brew method? And each one of those is a little different. You got to have a little bit of an understanding, or you'll be chasing your tail over, what caused the problem. But nowadays, if you call up an importer and ask for, let's say Costa Ricans, I'm looking for an 85 Costa Rican, and, maybe some specifics about flavor, you'll probably get 4 or 5 Costa Ricans that are in that range. Mm-hmm. But one's going to be more fruit, one's going to be more floral. You got to kind of pick which is the one for you. So I almost look at, especially for smaller roasters, it's not so much about defect recognition, because these coffees have been vetted, one, by people probably much more qualified than them as far as tasting and sample roast protocol and all that. But they often don't have that skill set to do it. It's more, what is it the one I like? What is the Costa Rican that fits my needs? I don't know if that makes sense to a certain extent, but I'm kind of in this quandary over what is, when I'm a teacher and I'm trying to get them to leave with, okay, what is the single most important thing? What's the number 2 most important thing? I'm starting to push defects down a little bit in, as far as sample roasting being a way to identify defects. There's the first part is, qualitative, do I like it? That's always important, but anyway.
Well, it makes sense because these folks are focused solely almost on the cupping. Like you said, they have the skill sets, and we've developed to the point where it's kind of like thinking of those YouTube channels where they give millennials or whatever rotary phones, and they say, like, try to make a phone call on this. Like, they don't even know what it is. So if we've lost our ability or the need actually to identify defects because the things that we're getting are so defect free, it's a good question. Like, how much of our time and energy goes into being able to train ourselves to identify defects, which I guess it wouldn't be a total waste to be able to identify them, even if you can trust, and you should trust, your importer. But
right.
So you're identifying coffee based on what you like and what you think your customers are going to like, of course. So when we're entering into sample roasting, then what's the framework mentally that we have to have when we're selecting things for illustrative roasting, for purchasing? I mean, how much do we need to actually roast, and what kind of decisions are we making then and there, practically speaking, for the customer and for our own business?
Well, to me, this is going to sound a little self-serving, but I think some education. It doesn't have to be a formal class with me, but some way to calibrate, some way to, because, tasting sensory, and this is where this initial sample roast protocol came into play. It's part of a sensory evaluation. We have rules and protocols. Okay, what we're trying to do is take something that is very, very subjective, and at the end of the day, no matter what any of us who teach it or say it, we're still looking for things we like. But we're trying to take this very subjective experience and make it as objective as possible. This is what gets into a protocol for roasting. So we're eliminating, when I'm tasting that cup, so protocol for roasting for buying, just to be clear on that. So when I'm, tasting and I'm going, whoa, is that acidity's low or there's whatever, did I do it as a roaster? It's so tough to learn sensory because we all have so many, nobody's been classically sensory trained. We all have so many different things that we tasted when we were growing up that were maybe different. I tell a story a lot about, my grandma had a strawberry pie that I found out just a short while ago, after she had passed, that was half raspberry, half strawberry. And to this day, when I taste raspberry and strawberries, I struggle. I have this little mental, you see my brain smoking a little bit because it's difficult. Okay. And I'm sure it was just she, ran out one day for a party and threw it in and everybody loved it. And that's grandma's secret recipe now, but we all have that. We all have so many of those, just where we were born, how we were raised, that we overcome. So to get back to the trying to be as objective as possible, whether it's addressing, do I want to buy this coffee or which profiles are good, is you need a little bit of training. So you're setting things up. I mean, things we go through. I just taught a basic sensory class this week, and it's, from how you set up the cups, making sure they're all the same. If one's red, one's blue, one's pink, and you love pink, well, are you going to score that coffee higher? I mean, it sounds silly, but little things like that count. The environment, the room, the coffee to water ratio, the whole 9 yards. But most importantly is the calibration. I just had this 2 weeks ago at a class where one of the students was just dead set. Anything dark roast, anything hinted dark roast was wrong. And I made it my mission to prove him wrong. Not that I'm a dark roast lover, but there's a time and place for him. But if you're going to do them right. And so he hated them. And he just, but eventually one day he's going to have enough customers. I should offer one. And instead of taking it seriously, and he already has a bias against it, he's just going to roast a coffee dark. So what we did is I did some sample roasts of different versions of a dark roast, same coffee. One that I would consider, still some development, still some flavor, one that wasn't. And then we cupped them blind. And I won't say it changed his world, but it certainly kind of woke him up going, wow, I have never even had. And we all have those biases. I'm more a medium roast guy. Dark roast, I tend to pick on a little bit. Super light roast, of the whether you want to call it the third wave or whatever. I have some of my dislikes for it. I've seen some nice things, but I generate back to medium roast. But that's what I kind of grew up with. That was my first love, so to speak. So I know I'm very subjective when it comes to that. So anyway, so some kind of training, and whether it's maybe calibrating with your importer, cupping with other people, is, you sometimes may like something just because it's different, but it's actually kind of defective. We had this yesterday in a class with this Guatemala, was one of the really quick, short development time roasts. It wasn't fruit, it was sour. And two of them really liked it, and it was just because they were looking for something a little, lighter, more in the fruit floral range. And this was just one hint of it, and they fell in love with it. So today, what I'm going to do for them is I roasted last night a lighter version of this coffee that will take that sourness away and pop the fruit. And it's going to be interesting to see what they think. But I think then they will go back to that one that they loved yesterday and go, oh, yeah, you're right. That is a little pucker my lip type, So getting back to kind of, the idea of having some sort of training, some sort of calibration, some sort of way to help you become as objective as possible in something that's really tough to be subjective, objective at, so you can use it for business decisions, and it's a tough one, because you still want things you like, but is what you like really, I don't want to say good, and not to pick on anybody's likes, but, especially when you're newer to the industry, and maybe haven't tasted your way through all kinds of different roasts and, and kind of, see the potential, it'd be difficult.
Yeah. And knowing yourself a little bit in the process, like you get to know yourself and your own biases, like you mentioned. It seems like a combination of being a filter and a conduit at the same time. Like you're channeling all of these different inputs of your own desires and those who are around you, even the industry and what the industry says that you should find acceptable. And then there's the customers who maybe are not even plugged in at all to that. And they have, like you mentioned, your customer that might end up with a dark roast customer base that he needs to serve. And so, you have all these different inputs kind of synthesized into, how you approach choosing what coffees serve those needs of all those people affected by your buying decisions, right? And exactly. So how do you then, after you've kind of gone through the pains of just checking those biases and accounting for those things, I'm sure there's a certain level of a reasonable number of sample roasts that you need to do on a coffee in order to make a good buying decision about a coffee. Like, is it 2? Is it 3? Are there a few days? How should you let it age and then taste it again? What do you typically recommend as sort of like the priorities of sample roasting frequency in order to make a good buying decision for those things we just mentioned?
I think for buying coffee, you should be able to get to the point fairly quickly that you can do it in one cupping. I very seldom have gone back. First, if you're kind of solid in your sample roast profile, so you're hitting a profile that is not some kind of roast defect, or you haven't developed enough. So if you're confident in that, okay, and sticking to the sample roast protocol, an 8 to 12 minute roast, 58 whole bean, 63 ground Agtron. And if you don't have an Agtron, there's other ways that you can kind of calibrate to that, sort of thing. If you're confident of that, I usually have always been able to make a decision just off that first cupping of whether I want to buy it. There have been occasions, there's been, if we go back in time here, where Wanda had the potato defect, with sometimes I might put out 5 cups and put out another 10 cups. And, just to, there's some particular reasons. Occasionally, I would know when I roasted it that, I didn't quite hit that profile. So sometimes I wouldn't re-roast it. I would just make a little note, and then I go and cup it and went, oh, yeah, I see what I did. I took it a little longer, so some of the acidity is muted. But you know what? I still like that coffee. I'm going to buy it, But I'd probably say in the course of 35 years, I've probably gone back and re-roasted and cupped the coffee to buy a dozen times at most, just to kind of check in. But knowing your protocols were all right. Because you could be under roasting or over roasting and that's why you don't like it. And that may be the case. And generally I try to cup those within 24 hours, following the full protocol. Just one, that's what I do for a living. So I say. But I have found it very helpful. It allows me to calibrate when I'm making a decision to purchase. All that stuff is the same, so I'm not going back now. Illustrative roasting or okay, now I'm going to create a profile. Oh, that could be, and sometimes even in class, we were talking about this yesterday. So an example between, say, Ethiopian and a Guatemalan, generally Ethiopians, I like lighter, brighter, shorter. Most of us in the industry, we don't like them dark roast. Not that an African is not good as a dark roast, but Ethiopian in particular, you've paid a premium for fruit and floral and, all these delicate notes. And, find another African to dark roast is my argument, but much past the medium roast, I think everything special is kind of gone. Not a general rule, not a, in concrete, never changed my mind, but most of us, I think, would agree with that. Guatemalans, like this one we're roasting in class this week, generally, I have very few that I really like as a light roast. I'm more like, I like those medium to dark. That is something that I've learned over the course of, 30 some years. So generally when I go to those different origins, I kind of have an idea what I want my profile to be. I kind of know, instead of going, in class, what we do is we start with a, light, medium, dark, very far apart. And then we start, kind of coming closer and trying different development times and all that. And that's just more to illustrate the wide array of what's possible and can they get the roaster to do that? So it's not so much about, it is about the sensory journey. But all that said, 30-some years of roasting, we have a little side business, my wife and I. It's called Firedancer, so no plug. You can take this out if you want, but it's Firedancer in Spanish. But it's just family and friends. Mom and Dad have been getting free coffee for life, so if I cut that out, they're going to disown me. But she bought a Ethiopian Yirgacheffe from she buys only women-produced farms. I set the profile, and this is now, we bought a full bag about 4 or 5 months ago. And so I've done 12, 15 roasts on it on our 5 kilo. I think I just finally nailed the profile. Yeah. And not that any of the others that I had done were like, they were all drinkable. I mean, it was everyone's favorite coffee. It's become, family friends. It's what we bring home on the weekend. So it was never bad. But every single time I'm tasting it going, no, there's something more there.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Anyway, just to illustrate that sometimes it's elusive. I never quite feel like I get it right. Sometimes it takes a little while. Other times you have coffees that are just like, they can almost handle every profile well, so you don't really overthink it.
Mm-hmm.
So I know kind of a non-answer, but so when it gets, and then illustrative roasting, I'd add illustrative roasting or profile roasting. I do think then it's important to let the coffee sit a little bit, because we're freshness. We're kind of changing our, at least I am. Where Alfred Pete used to say, the specialty coffee is the shortest time to roast to consumer. And I still basically agree with that. But I hear, so we have this we roast to order, which I think in most cases is a lie. Nobody orders coffee in the size of your roaster. You're roasting to a forecast to try to get it out within a day or two.
Right.
But what recent science and stuff has kind of taught us, and even in my own experience, we've kind of known this with espresso, that right out of the roaster, not so good. You need to let it rest. What is that sweet spot? 3 to 5 days. Then maybe up to 2 weeks after that, you can make something really good. So we've known that with espresso. Different theories, different opinions, but generally, I'd say we all agree on that. We're starting to know this with drip coffee. There's coffees that I have sample roasted and cupped and made a decision, and won't say it ever goes back and changes my mind on the purchasing decision I made, but it's been, that's good. And then, hey, there's 50, 60 grams left, and I need a pot of coffee that morning. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I want to make this pot. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, my good, where did that come from? Well, it settled down in a way where I've had others that have been phenomenal. And then a couple of days after roast, it's like, oh, yeah, yawn, So I do think that illustrate, and then you get into the type of brew method you're going to use on it. There's some that, you could throw at any brew method. Coffee and or profile, and then there's some that this is only really going to work on a Chemex,
right?
Or kind of a very narrow focus, and that's the side just personally between you and me that I'm really more the science and the why is that? I have ideas and thoughts, and I think we all do. But is that the next coming of coffee, where we have very specific coffee, very specifically roasted for a very specific brew device?
Right.
Some are doing that, but then I kind of go, oh, whoa, that just made my head hurt.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's illustrative roasting for a reason, right? There's a lot of different. You have to picture that coffee in a lot of different scenarios, and I like the idea of putting that coffee, forecasting it into the kitchens of your customers, for example. Like, what are they doing to brew that coffee? You mentioned this in the article, how if you're cupping your coffee for espresso, you're just not going to make good decisions around it. In a similar way, like anybody who's really trying to develop a profile for their coffee through sample roasting and cupping and quality control protocols, that is not, brewing the coffee on the way that the cafes are brewing the coffee. There's going to be a disconnect between what the cafes give them as feedback for the coffee and what the cuppers of the coffee thought were the notes that they should put on the bag when the customers buy it and use it on their K cups and their whatever brewers. Maybe they bought your brewer from the shelf and they're doing pretty well for themselves, but typically that's not the case. So you're making that distinction between purchasing for cupping for purchasing coffee, and then once you get that coffee, you're actually you're seeing what it can do. You're putting it through its paces, and I suppose that you need to have a certain knowledge about, like, if the coffee on the table I'm cupping once, for purchase does this in the cup. I know it has potential when I get it in for profile development. Sounds like that's something you can really only develop through time. Like there doesn't seem like there's really hard and fast rules for, bridging that gap between the two.
No, I agree completely. It's and even in my own profile, like I said, I made the example of the Ethiopian, but it's I feel like I'm on a constant journey of illustrating coffees in different manners, and then you hit upon something really important there that I think we all kind of, this has come up this class really big that I've never really been brought up, is just the, how are you educating consumers to brew coffee properly? I make comment all the time that, how many people know how to fry an egg properly? And what astounds me is very few. Most of they could cook it, but can they really make it creamy and and do it gently and all that? In coffee brewing is, I would say, even a little bit easier than even that. But many people, we spend all this time creating all this wonderful, buying the coffee the way we talk about it and then illustrating it and then putting it into a brew device. But are we the only ones capable of brewing it in that manner? And everything we just said. So, sometimes, and this is something that I've done a little bit. I won't say I've done a ton of it, which is really kind of think about, okay, this particular coffee, this is like a house blend that everyone loves. Everyone's going, I need to make it so it has a little broader sweet spot, i.e. so it can take a grind that's maybe a little finer, a little coarser, a little less coffee, maybe a little bit more coffee. So it's a little bit more forgiving. And, and then do we market coffee that way to, hey, consumer, you're not quite as experienced to handle this coffee, so you need this coffee. I don't want to get to that point. I don't mean that, but it is this avenue where I have created, where I thought, wow, this coffee's great, and I give it to somebody, and I realize I've only been drinking it on a Chemex, and they have a Mr. Coffee, and they say, yeah, it was okay. Mm-hmm. Something broke there, something, and both on my side and then whatever. And it's I think one of the other missing links is tying what these two things to that, which I think may be impossible. I don't know. It's it's the final step in that chain, the consumer.
Yeah. Yeah, we're obsessed with our equipment, and we are very good about learning it and calibrating it. Maybe we need to send out a survey and just find out what all of our customers brew at home with. And get a little bit more obsessed about how the end user is actually, illustrating that coffee in their own cup, So the idea of now taking that coffee and putting it through its paces in the sample roaster and then translating it to the production roaster, that's another game entirely. I know it depends on the roaster that you have, and both the what kind of sample roaster you have and then what kind of production roaster you have. But in your years of doing this, what are some of the guidelines that people need to follow when they want to translate what they know is possible with the coffee through the sample roasting, the illustrative sample roasting, and then putting that into the production roast and hoping to get the same result or something similar? What do we need to do there?
That's a great question. And first I start with the going back one step, which is, do you need to buy a sample roaster if you're a roaster? Yeah, you kind of do. Is the very first step is, and it's hard sometimes when, they've already bought their $50,000 12 kilo and, whoever, and, I'm not going to pick on any roaster manufacturer, there wasn't any kind of, education that, you probably need a sample roaster. So they look in their eyes get big. Really? I got to spend another, couple hundred or a few $1,000s. What? So then it gets into making your decision. And like in the article, I kind of outline, that things have changed a little bit. Sample roasters, when I first got into the business, were basically, the barrel, either a Burns or a Probot, barrel roaster. And then there was basically, popcorn roasters. There wasn't really much in the middle. And then nowadays, what's in the middle, I think is actually better for roasters than even, I have a 2-barrel BRZ $10,000 roaster in my lab, and I use it. If I'm going to knock out 30 samples, I can do it really quickly, efficiently. But I would never use those old school, we'll call them sample roasters, really as a profiler, because they really, one, you don't get good accurate temperature readings. It's really just turning it green to brown in then 8 to 12 minutes. That's what they're made to do. The cheap home ones, but no way, you can't. So anyway, so there's middle ground, like I'm referring to things like the Quest M3, the Aurelio Bullet, the Hookey 500, these are things you can outlay with data loggers, and you can track the profile, so you have some idea what you just did. Then it comes to, do you need to align your roaster with the type of, large roaster you can? I would say yes, wholeheartedly. If you can align the type of heat transfer, like for, I happen to be here at Dietrich this week, so the Quest M3 for me is the closest to the Dietrich, because it's an electric burner. It's a great little $1,500 unit, but being electric, it reacts a little bit more like the energy transfer in a Dietrich. Which I don't want to go down the deep hole of the science between them. Right. Does it make a Dietrich better? Does it make it worse? It's different. Okay, and so then there is, if you had a Loring, you might look at, this is a little higher end of that cost, but an Akawa, which is a little bit more convection roast, so it does make it easier to translate whatever you've created on that sample roaster to the large roaster. However, even if Dietrich, I have a 1 kilo Dietrich in my lab, and I have a 5 kilo, okay, and I do some profile on the 1 kilo, just really to get to know the 1 kilo better, and I nailed a profile one time, and okay, now I got to convert this to the 5 kilo. Same basic technology made by the same company. It's not a simple formula. It's not you did this on this, here's what you got to do on that. No, you have to know both roasters. You have to, when I say know both roasters, that you bought some coffee, and I don't want to say a cheap coffee to burn through, but you really know how to get it longer, shorter at different phases, how to drag along development time without stalling. So you really got to know both roasters well. Once you do, even if your roaster is a little bit different, an Akawa profile, which is more convection related to, say, a Dietrich, a little bit more difficult, but, and in fact, I would say probably not going to be able to nail the profile exactly because of how they roast. But if you know them both well, you can do that. And really what you tend to focus on is you got to ignore temperatures, trying to, relate a temperature or charge temp on a sample roaster to a charge temp on a production roaster. What you really want to focus on are the key development phases, that if you're taking a class or whatever. So, what is your turnaround time? Or when the temperature, you put the beans in, they endothermically are absorbing the heat, and they reach thermal equilibrium, and it goes up a degree. What is that time? What is the time that yellow starts? What one of the first, so your drying phase is ended, the ratio of yellowing to cinnamon to first crack, so more match those time and percent of that time of the total roast. If you can match those things on a larger roaster, you'll come close to a really close profile. But it goes back to what I said earlier. You gotta know your roaster very well to be able to do that. Because it's not X times Y, divided by 2, it's not some simple formula that you use to correlate it. It's difficult, and even, that's even true. It even gets more critical. One of the things I get, I don't want to say, the most work from, but more than I thought, are companies that are actually, they have a 12 kilo, maybe 2 of them, they're going to the next phase. So they go to a 35 or a 70, or 2 bagger, and they can't dial their profiles up to the larger roaster. And so I get engaged, and it blows me away a little bit going, these roasters are really, really good. They wouldn't be buying a bigger roaster if they didn't know what they were doing. And it's I don't know if it's intimidation, if it's, because it's at some level not really difficult if you know roasting, but if you've never done it before, it's I guess it comes down to intimidation at some level.
Sure. What are when you get involved in those types of things? I imagine there's all sorts of false assumptions that people make when they're translating their sample roasting into production. I mean, what's the first assumption that's maybe the biggest one that gets people in trouble?
It sounds simple, but if, on my sample roaster, I had a charge temperature of 400 and 350, typically it would be lower. Typically sample roasters, you tend to be a little lower of a charge temp because they don't have that thermal energy. So they warm up quick, and cool down quick. So taking that and, that's what I got to do on my larger roaster. No, it's completely different. It's completely different how thermal energy is retained and put into the drum. So it's some level as simple as that, just the starting point. How hot is that drum when I put coffee into it? It's not going to be the same as from a small roaster to a larger roaster. Okay. How you figure that out is experience. I often say kind of what I like to keep the same, and this isn't any rule or it's nothing in the SCA curriculum, but, when we talk around turnaround point, is on any roaster, what I try to do is not keep it the same from a sample roaster to a large roaster, but on that particular roaster, always have it the same. That's my first kind of check-in point. And what I mean by that is even if I'm taking because the other thing that comes into play is people trying to take a 5-pound, they're doing a half batch roast because they just bought a nice coffee. They want to keep it fresh. So, they don't have sales yet. And then all of a sudden, people love it. So now, I want to dial that up to be a full profile or a full batch. Okay. And so what that means is you need more energy. So you need to raise, first part is charge temp. Well, how hard do you weigh it? If my 5-pound batch is 375, what do I take my full batch to? And kind of my check-in point. And then how do I know that's right? Well, I usually say, try to, 400, 425, whatever it is, try to match the turnaround time you had on the half batch. Because at least then from there, I've done it the same. You still have to make other adjustments differently, more coffee, maybe higher energy, airflow at different times. But at least that first step is the same, and then from there, you got to go to the next, what's my next check-in point? Maybe color change, and keep that the same. But I think a lot of people just, I hear this a lot where it's that starting point, just that charge temp. And then from there, and if that's wrong, you really can't get, I won't say you can't get everything else right and you can't correct it still, but to a certain extent you can't because you haven't started right. I don't know if that made sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So just making sure that you're not doing a one-for-one comparison, of course, and again, know your equipment, keep the charge temp the same, and then make sure that you're just getting consistent checkpoints that are, basically being used for all the coffees, but then letting the coffee kind of tell you how it's behaving in the production roast as you go. And that was one of the things that you talked about in the article, or was mentioned in the article, was that the observation of how the bean behaves seems to be the only translatable thing between sample roasting and production roasting, is that somehow the behavior of the coffee is somewhat similar between the two, just based on its nature.
Completely, and that's one, just to go back to most sample roasters. What I love about sample roasting and smaller roasters is it's very visceral. I just find that the smells, color changes. You tend to be a little bit more. This may sound weird, but intimate with it. When you dial it up in a bigger, not that you're not putting coffee out of the dryer and, there's not the smells and all that, but it's a little bit different. But I think that's what, and I also advise, and I talked about it just yesterday, is I don't want people to be the nervous roaster or the show off roaster where they're sticking, taking coffee out of the dryer every 10 seconds. Think like, what are you doing? All you're doing is trying to show off, or you're really that nervous. But the point being, however, at some level, especially like in these classes, and as you're developing, what I find is when I'm developing profiles or matching on a larger roaster, I at one time was tasked with taking a 2-bag roast profile and moving it up to it was a 6-minute 1,000-pound roast batch, and they wanted to try to match the profile. So it was a commercial roaster had bought a specialty roaster, and executives had decided that this is more efficient. And I think the idea why they hired me is the roasters were pretty smart. They knew, that it couldn't be done. They wanted a second opinion. We got a lot closer than we thought, and it was really just trying to match the kind of color changes and kind of how the coffee acted. Is really because the profile on that roaster wasn't a profile. It was like a check mark. It was just goes straight up really quick, and we didn't get a match because, we didn't get the body development, with that quick of a roast, it's just not going to happen, but got far closer than I ever even thought possible. And it was really just focused on what you just mentioned is kind of watching the coffee and trying to get it to react as possible. And that was a roaster that I had no experience at. I had no idea, I hadn't spent a lot of time on it. But their roaster had. And I said, okay, let's go do a roast on the 2-bag roaster. You just sit there and pull that trier, almost every minute, and then get up on the big one and try to mimic that. So, anyway, hugely important is that kind of visual, when I'm developing something or trying to match something, because it really tells me, a little bit more of what's going on than just, a log or a temperature or exhaust temp or whatever.
Yeah, it makes sense. And of course, the theme throughout this, conversation is that there are systems in place and that there are protocols in place and there are things that we would hold ourselves to. That's not necessarily the case for a lot of people, and maybe that's just because when in coffee we tend to be artists and free thinkers and all this other stuff. And so systems tend to fall by the wayside and maybe even sound corporate to a lot of independent coffee roasters. And you do see a lot more systems. This goes for cafes as well as it does for roasteries, I suppose, that, you get the large corporate people that recognize the value of having SOPs and systems for consistency's sake, but then you struggle to find similar things in independent or smaller operations. I wonder what your take on that is, like why that is, and then talk a little bit about what are the base SOPs and systems needed for people to put in place, no matter the size of their roaster.
Oh, that's a deep question. And I'll I'm going to answer the kind of the last first because it comes back around. It's that one of the other things I do is I do food safety. I'm a certified food safety lead for warehouses, food manufacturing. So FDA for roasters and cold brew, et cetera. And I've done it my whole career. And that requires a ton of SOPs. Okay. Technically, everybody who's a roaster is under the FDA. They need a written food safety plan. And people freak out and think I'm trying to scare them. For a big roaster, that could be an average of about 125 documents. Forms, SOPs, checklists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People freak out. Like, how can I do that and stay in business? I'm a 2-person show. I'm not suggesting that. Okay. Start small. Start with basics. And because here's my reason. It's not because I think FDA is going to shut people down or, whatever that. It's just, it's more. At some point, you're going to have a call from a Costco who wants you in, or a Whole Foods. You got to have an audited food safety plan, and you have nothing in place, and you're starting from scratch. So anyway, my example to SOPs for quality control and all that is I've done a lot of this work over the last couple of years, and when I get done, I always write a final report, trying to get more business, that's what consultants do. But and I kind of point to their quality, and these are some of the rock stars of our industry, and say, you can't guarantee your quality to me. And it's like I stuck a knife in their back. They're offended, and it's like, because you have nothing documented. You have nothing, okay? And so to me, SOPs, writing things down, this is what we say we're going to do, and checking it. And then even the process of a food safety plan is the same for quality control or employee safety. It's risk assessment. You think about it this way. A truck comes to bring green coffee. So for a food safety standpoint, we want to make sure that truck doesn't have any, dead animals on it or mice and insects or oil or, things like that. From a employee safety, do my employees know how to lift? Do they know? Do we have a forklift training program? Do they put wheels or chocks in the wheels so they don't before they drive on it? Simple things like that. But quality is the same thing. What are the risks to the potential quality of that coffee? Okay, and we most companies do it all, but they don't have anything documented. So as they grow and people come on, things change. People do things just a little bit different their way because it's not documented, and that's where you start varying. From your quality, you're not being able to produce it. So, my advice is that it's probably one of the you don't need food safety. I said 125 documents. For a mid-sized company, for a small little roastery, you got a 12 kilo, 2 or 3 employees. You maybe need 10. But I would say for quality, you need the same. Define your quality. Define your cupping procedures. Keep notes as you cup. Track that. For anybody who's in that cupping room, hold them to the same standard. Hey, I want you to keep a journal of what you're tasting and log and all that. And this just it builds. And bottom line, it makes you a stronger company, a better company, more profitable, more nimble in so many different ways that it's, they're all aligned. I'm in the middle of working on see if SCA accepts it to do a lecture at Orleans this year, which is, I call it the trinity of running a successful roasting business, which is, food safety, employee safety, quality. They're all aligned. How you control them, the scientific discipline behind them, hazard analysis. So, what's the hazard to my employee, to my product, the end consumer, and my quality. It's the same process, and it's as simple as SOPs and, making sure everybody's on the same page, that this is, what we mean by this and why we do this. And if it changes, because that's what happens, you evolve. All these things always evolve. You're always growing as a company, that you make sure you go back and change that. So, okay, we used to do it that way. Now we do it this way. Here's why. Everyone aligned, Anyway, I think that kind of answered your question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's just the idea of intentionality behind what you do, and not making things accidental successes that you can't repeat in the future. I guess spending any amount of time forecasting what would happen if somebody really liked what we did and we couldn't repeat it would scare you enough, I think, to start, at least in some way, doing what you were talking about. Just start small and record things. And again, kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation about what illustrative roasting does is puts you in the position of kind of forecasting what the coffee is for and who it's for and how it behaves. So that forecasting and looking to the future seems to come into play most of the way in this process. So this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm really glad that you've been able to share so much about illustrative roasting. And I like the phrase, hope it catches on. That's a... Yeah,
I want to be known to be author of one cool term in coffee.
Yeah.
Actually, I think we need another new cool term, like we need a hole in our head. But anyway,
I think that there's a lot to still learn about this. People can do that by reading this article, listening to it on the audio articles at Roast Magazine, and there's a lot of things that you can teach them too. Over at Firedancer, tell us a little bit about where people can find more information about what you offer and how you can help them.
Yeah, well, we first, we're a small little company, just my wife and I. She's also a fellow ASD. She does brewing and barista. She does kind of the front of house, cafes. She ran restaurants, her whole career, Starbucks. She used to work for the Coffee Association. And I do more of the back of house, finding the coffee, bringing it in, that whole 9 yards. Our website, we have 2 of them. One is, but they both link to each other. Firedancercoffee.com and then firedancereducators.com. We made the educator site a little bit more playful. Not quite as serious, but not that education is not serious, but it's we want it to be a fun journey.
Yeah.
The consulting side, since I do the regulatory, that's got to be, I got to sound like I'm a stuffy, businessman in a white suit. because it is regulatory. But there's information on both the sites linked to us. Info@firedancercoffee.com gets to either Renee or I. We offer free 30-minute consultations for whether it's consulting or, really more importantly, is SCA has created an awesome education system. I would argue that they're probably not very good at communicating and explaining, how to transverse it. It's a new system. I'm not picking on them, but it's to understand, okay, what is right for me? What is the path? What's the timing? That sort of thing. Happy to hop on a call and talk you through, because everybody's needs are a little bit different, and it can be a very intimidating process. And on the educator site, there's the full calendar. We are fully open. We have all the SCA courses on the calendar every month, except the professional levels, the large ones. Those are not a big demand, and not a lot of people can take 4 or 5 days off to go take a pro course, but we have a couple of them every quarter. But it's all on the website. But if there's any question about anything, feel free to reach out at that email, info@firedancercoffee.com, and one of us will respond very quickly with any questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks for sharing with us today, and thanks for all you're doing.
You are welcome. Thanks for having me, and it was great. I mean, I think you and I have known each other for a while, but this is the first time we really got to talk, so I was looking forward to that. So it's been fun. I appreciate it.
Well, I hope that you all enjoyed that episode, and I hope that it gave you some ideas of how you can approach sample roasting in your roastery to create more possibilities for your coffees, to dive deeper into what these coffees have to offer. And I know just by this conversation that Mike has given us a lot of tools and insights to help us level up all of our sample roasting. So a huge thank you to Mike for joining us on the show, for all the teaching that you do, for your many years in service to the coffee industry. Thank you so much. And if you're interested in talking with Mike and working with Firedancer Coffee Consultants, you can go to their website, firedancercoffee.com, for all the information you need. Again, that's firedancercoffee.com. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback about this episode or any other episode of Keys to the Shop, feel free to email me. My email is chris@keystotheshop.com. I really hope that you're enjoying these roasting-focused episodes and that it's helping you in your roastery. I really appreciate you listening, and as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.